Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 25th February 2019. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. This news has been taken from page number 7 and is stating that as per the Central Information Commission, an EVM, that is an electronic voting machine, is an information under the Right to Information Act. Now this news can come both in your prelims as well as in your mains under GS paper 2 in the category of important aspects of governance and transparency. Now though this news is giving us just one point, but such points become very important considering the fact that previously also, especially in the year 2018, UPSC is now asking questions based on such single points. For example, in 2018, they asked a question on Aadhaar, in which one statement said that Aadhaar can be used as a proof of citizenship or domicile, and the second one said once issued, Aadhaar number cannot be deactivated or omitted by the issuing authority. Now both these statements were wrong and the right answer was D. But I hope you understand that such small informations can also become very important when you look at them in the larger context of how question paper is being set. Now as per the news, the Central Information Commission has ruled that an electronic voting machine is an information under the Right to Information Act. Now this decision by the CIC was given in a unique RTI application in which the applicant had demanded an EVM machine from the Election Commission. The Election Commission then rejected the application, saying that the EVMs which is held by it do not come under the definition of an information as provided under the Right to Information Act. Before we go any further, let's see what is the definition of information under the Right to Information Act. Now the information means any material in any form, including documents, emails, opinions, circulars, contacts, reports, samples, models, data material in any electronic form, and information relating to any private body which can be accessed by a public authority under any law for the time being in force. Now for our discussion, please remember that information includes sample and models and any material in any form. Now the Election Commission's contention was that though Election Commission has the models and the samples of the EVM machine available with them, but such models and samples are for training purposes and are not saleable to the general public. So the Election Commission said that though they have the sample and the model of the EVM, which they also admitted during the hearing, but then they said that such models and samples of EVM is not for the general public. But then the CIC ruled that the EVM which is available with the Election Commission in any material form and also as a sample which has been admitted by the Election Commission during the hearing is an information under the Right to Information Act. But the case did not end here. The second contention which was raised by the Election Commission of India as to why it is not providing information was that the Election Commission said that the software which has been installed on these electronic voting machine is an intellectual property of some third party, and the disclosure of the EVMs will then harm the competitive edge of this third party whose software has been installed. And this argument by the Election Commission of India was also agreed to and upheld by the CIC. Now Section 8 of the Right to Information Act provides us with certain exceptions. And as per Section 8, Clause 1, Subclause D, any information including commercial confidence, trade secret or intellectual property, the disclosure of which would harm the competitive position of a third party, such an information is an exception, can be withheld by the authorities. But in this case, interestingly, after the CIC did accept the Election Commission of India's argument regarding the intellectual property of a third party installed on these EVMs, but the CIC did not give any view as to whether it was upholding or rejecting the Election Commission of India's position on this commercial confidence and this intellectual property argument. All that the CIC said was that the rejection of the application was erroneous and that the Election Commission of India should give a fresh reply to this applicant as per the RTI provision. But what is relevant from our UPSC is the fact that an electronic voting machine is an information under the RTI. But all of this application and this decision has happened in the wake of the fact that a lot of people in our country, including the opposition parties, are doubting the efficacies of the EVMs. So therefore, probably this application was filed under the RTI to carry out an own personal scrutiny. Now, since the news mentioned about the CIC, let us very briefly look at its main point. Now, the Central Information Commission will consist of one Chief Information Commissioner and not more than 10 Information Commissioner. The Chief Information Commissioner and the Information Commissioners are appointed by the President on the recommendation of a committee which consists of the Prime Minister, who is also the chairperson of this committee, the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha, as well as a Union Cabinet Minister. The term of the CIC is of 5 years or until he or she attains the age of 65. And please remember that the members of the CIC are not eligible for reappointment with the government. Further, as far as removal is concerned, the Chief Information Commissioner or the Information Commissioners are removed from their office only by an order of the President on the ground of proven misbehavior or incapacity. But this order shall only be passed when the President makes a reference to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court has upheld these charges of proven misbehavior or incapacity. Then only if the Supreme Court says that they ought to be removed, the President will remove the members of the Central Information Commission. So to quickly recapitulate, the Central Information Commission consists of a Chief Information Commissioner and not more than 10 Information Commissioner who are appointed by the President on the recommendation of a committee consisting of the Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition in the Lok Sabha and a Union Cabinet Minister. The tenure of the members are 5 years or until the age of 65 and they are not eligible for reappointment with the government. Lastly, they can only be removed by the President on the grounds of proven misbehavior and incapacity after the Supreme Court, on a reference made to it by the President, has reported that any of the members ought to be removed. Lastly, please remember that the Central Information Commission and the State Information Commission are not constitutional bodies but are rather statutory bodies as they have been constituted under the Right to Information Act of 2005. Therefore, they are statutory bodies and not constitutional bodies. With this, let's move on to our next news. This next news appears on page number 7, in which the Indian Air Force is upgrading its aerial surveillance. As per the news, the Indian Air Force will upgrade its aerial surveillance capability with a new age hyperspectral imaging program, which is expected to be operational by the year 2021. Under this project, the hyperspectral imaging sensors and cameras will be mounted on unmanned aerial vehicles or the UAVs. This project is primarily aimed at upgrading aerial surveillance capabilities of the Indian Air Force. Therefore, from the part of your syllabus, it will fall under the category of science and technology. Now, the hyperspectral imaging is a combination of two technologies, that is spectroscopy and digital imaging. In a layman term, spectroscopy is the study of interaction between a matter or an object and the electromagnetic radiation. We'll be talking about this more later. Now, under this project of the Indian Air Force, the sensors of the cameras which are mounted on the UAVs will take images in two wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, namely the visible light and the infrared. The images so taken will then be run through the deep learning algorithms to process them into usable data, and then this data will be communicated to the Indian Air Force Strategy Cell. Now, the principle of spectroscopy is that when an electromagnetic wave shines on a surface of an object, some wavelengths are absorbed while other wavelengths are reflected. To give you an example, the color of the leaf is green because it absorbs the red and the violet light, but it reflects the green light, which is then what we see as the green color. So you should know that similarly, all objects absorb and reflect certain wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is unique to that object only. So therefore, you can say that every object has its own spectral signature. Spectral signature would mean that a particular object will absorb certain wavelength and would reflect certain wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, this technology of spectroscopy is used in hyperspectral imaging, which collects and processes information about an object across the electromagnetic spectrum. So therefore, this hyperspectral imaging enables distinct identification of the various objects. Because under this imaging, every pixel in an image would acquire a different light intensity. And therefore, every pixel in that image will characterize the object with great detail and precision. See, what happens with a normal color camera is that it acquires only 3 different spectral channels corresponding to the visual primary colors of red, green and blue. But the hyperspectral images acquire all the spectral channels across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And further, this light intensity is acquired for every pixel in that image. So to give you an example, this is an object. Under the hyperspectral imaging, consider that the small circle is 1 pixel. So within that 1 pixel also, light intensity will be acquired according to the different waves in the electromagnetic spectrum. So then you can imagine that this will help in create an image which will have great precision and detail. And it is for this reason that the hyperspectral imaging leads to a vastly improved ability to classify the objects in a scene based on their spectral properties. So under hyperspectral imaging, the images will provide specific information about the way an object transmits, reflects or absorbs energy in various wavelengths, and not just in the 3 wavelengths of blue, green and red which an ordinary color camera uses. So it is for this reason that hyperspectral imaging finds its use in firstly military application, because it can be used for new generation aerial surveillance, where it can perform surveillance in areas which are under dense tree cover along the international border. Further, it can help to track adversary movement in day and night condition, and also because it works effectively in all weather conditions, be it cloud cover, dense fog or snow cover. Secondly, it can be used for crop or drought monitoring. Thirdly, for mapping of soil moisture or mineral prospecting, etc. So as a recapitulation, you need to know that hyperspectral imaging combines the technology of spectroscopy and digital imaging. And the unique point about hyperspectral imaging is that it collects and processes information across all the wavelengths in an electromagnetic spectrum. And this enables it to create a distinct identification of objects where images are created with great detail and precision. Now you would also be knowing that in November 2018, ISRO launched the HISIS Advanced Earth Observation Satellite, which too is based on the principle of hyperspectral imaging. Here is a hyperspectral image, and as you can see, an hyperspectral image measures the spectrum of the light in each pixel. So here you see is a small pixel, and within this small pixel also, this imaging will measure how different wavelengths are absorbed in that pixel. And then on the right you see how these components of spectrum can be used in various applications. For example, this is showing you vegetation. This will give you information about the background soil, about the mineral deposited. So I hope now you understand the basic concept of how a hyperspectral imaging works. With this, let's move on to our next news. This next news appears on page number 1 and is talking about the violent protests which are taking place in the state of Arunachal Pradesh after the state government's proposal to grant permanent residence certificate to 6 non-tribal communities. Now from the perspective of the syllabus, it will fall under GS paper 2 under the category of governance. The Arunachal Pradesh government has proposed to grant the permanent residence certificate to 6 non-tribal communities residing in Arunachal Pradesh. Now this permanent residence certificate is basically a legal document which is issued to Indian citizens as an evidence of their residence. So basically it is considered as a residential proof for official purposes. Now this PRC is very useful in availing reservation against the quotas reserved for state residents in educational institute and quota-based jobs. So it is for this benefit of reservation which is given to state resident in a particular state that there is such a hue and cry to obtain this permanent residence certificate. Now the background of the issue is that there has been a long pending demand of 6 communities in Arunachal Pradesh to get PRC so as to be recognized as the residents of the state. These 6 communities are Adivasi, Deori, Gorkha, Mishing, Moran and Sonowal. Now most of these communities are recognized as scheduled tribes in the neighboring state of Assam, but as far as Arunachal Pradesh is concerned, these communities are non-natives of Arunachal Pradesh, but then again have been living in the state for decades. Further, a joint high power committee was constituted who gave the recommendation that these 6 communities should be given the permanent residence certificate. So therefore, based on the recommendation of this joint high power committee, the government promised to give PRC to these communities last year. But then, this proposal by the government brought a lot of resentment among several community-based groups and students' organizations in Arunachal Pradesh who claim that the rights and interests of the indigenous people of the state of Arunachal Pradesh will be compromised if the state government gives these 6 communities PRC status. Now, this is the same old issue which is plaguing the states of Assam, Tripura, etc., where the indigenous people of the state fear that giving the resident status to non-native communities will have an adverse impact on their opportunities, especially in the context of jobs and educational institutes. Now, from your exams perspective, it is important to remember the name of the 6 communities, that is Adivasi, Deori, Gorkha, Mishing, Moran and Sonowal, and to just generally have the basic overview of this entire issue. As with the other state, this news again is in transition, and as has happened with Assam, we can expect that this news will be stretched and linger on for a very long time. And even in the coming weeks or probably months, we'll be hearing about this issue again and again. So therefore, it is very important to have the basic idea about why these protests are happening. So with this, let's move on to our next news. This next news is an article taken from page number 8 and is in the context of nitrogen pollution in water. It will form a part of GS paper 3 under the category of environment, especially environmental pollution. Now the author begins his article by giving us a few facts and figures. The major of them is that as per WHO reports, 21% of communicable diseases in India are caused due to water contamination. Further, 10% of deaths in India are due to diseases which are directly or indirectly transmitted through water. So the author is saying, where at one hand, the waterborne disease risk in India is continuously increasing, on the other hand, nitrogen pollution is also a growing concern in India. Now, though nitrogen is a very important component in plant and animal growth, but excess nitrogen has a lot of environmental implications. The major sources of this excess nitrogen is firstly the heavy urea usage by the Indian farmers, and the second and the more serious one is the nitrogen pollution from the untreated sewage. Further, as per the study carried out by the Indian Nitrogen Group, which is a task force of scientists tracking this issue, according to them, the amount of reactive nitrogen in majority of water bodies in India have already crossed the prescribed WHO limit and are in fact twice more than the WHO limits. The reactive forms of nitrogen are those forms which can have a cascading effect in the environment and can cause impact like smog, acid rain, biodiversity loss, etc. Now in this article, the author is providing us with 2 more reasons which are a grave cause to the leading nitrogen pollution. The first thing which the author is saying is that the toilets in our country are unconnected to the sewage system. The author is saying that ironically, India's largest attempt at cleanliness, that is the Swachh Bharat mission, is likely to add to this problem. Because under the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, in the past 4 years, over 9 crore toilets have been constructed. But not all those toilets which are constructed are connected to any sewage system. So the majority of the toilets which are not connected to the sewage system, all such toilets generate fecal sludge which has no place to go. So eventually what will happen is that all this fecal sludge will get dumped and will either pollute land, surface or groundwater and will kill our rivers and ponds. Further, as per the Central Pollution Control Board, 93% of the urban sewage which flows into the river is untreated. So the author says that these figures paint a really grim picture as far as the efficiency and working of the sewage system in India is concerned. Now secondly, the author says even where you have the toilets connected to the sewage system, the existing sewage system is not very effective in India. Again, he gives us certain figures. 1/3 of the installed sewage treatment capacity is dysfunctional, either fully or partially. Further, even where the plants are working, then those plants too are not working to their full capacity. Now, the reason for this is that the infrastructure which is needed to feed the sewage to these plants is inadequate. That is to say, You need a network of drains, sewers, and pumping stations to actually bring all this sewage and feed it into the treatment plant. But this infrastructure of pumping stations and drains is very much inadequate, and because of this, the plants are not able to work in its full capacity. Lastly, the author is asking that more attention should be given on sewage networks and treatment. Therefore, the policymaker and the government should give larger focus on sewage networks and treatment plant issues. Further, the author says that the civic administration should take up building of drains, sewers, as well as treatment plant with much more enthusiasm in line with the Swachh Bharat mission. That is, under the Swachh Bharat mission, the focus should not be only toilet construction but also on adding the ancillary infrastructure of drains, sewer and treatment plants. The author also says that in the smart city scheme, the amount of money being spent by the government in this scheme is very less as far as waste management is concerned. So only 2.4% of the total money has been allocated to waste management, which is very less. So the author says that in these new schemes where they are developing smart cities, at least in those cities, much focus should be given on creating a much more efficient and better waste management system. Further, the author says that even in the schemes like Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation, which has the provisions for funding sewage plant, such schemes should also be utilized. Because under the scheme, very few places have pitched in for a sewage treatment plant as an Amrut project. So the author says, though this scheme has a provision where you can fund a sewage plant, people are not using the funds of the scheme to make better sewage system and treatment plants. Finally, in the conclusion, the author says that the sewage and waste needs to become center stage in our policy debates and decisions. And lastly, he says that along with Bijli, Sadak, Pani, even Nali should become a mainstream political motto. So with this, let's move on to our next news. This next news appears on page number 7 and is talking about the decision of the Zoological Survey of India, where it is developing a new protocol for the use of DNA forensics in wildlife crime investigation. Now this news will fall both under the topics of environment and science and technology. Now the news says that the Zoological Survey of India is coming out with a protocol which will use DNA analysis in wildlife crime investigation. Now as per the section 2, subclause 37 of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, wildlife is defined to include any animal, crustacean, fish, moths, bees, butterflies, aquatic or land vegetation which forms a part of any habitat. Further, as per the Handbook for Wildlife Crime Investigation by the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau under the Ministry of Environment and Forest, wildlife crime is defined as taking, possession, trade, movement, processing or consumption of wild animals and plants or their derivatives in contravention to any international, regional or national legislation. Further, this definition these days have been expanded and even infliction of cruelty and the persecution of wild animal is sometimes added to this definition. Now you should have some idea as to what laws are governing this field of wildlife crime. In India, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 is the umbrella legislation as far as wildlife crime enforcement is concerned. Further, India is also a signatory to the CITES, which is a voluntary agreement regulating international commercial wildlife trade. In addition to this, you should know that the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has included wildlife crime as in transnational organized crime. Thus, UNODC recognizes wildlife crime as a transnational organized crime. Very unfortunately, the conviction rate for wildlife crime is very low in India, and it is broadly due to 3 reasons. Firstly, the techniques which are used in wildlife crime investigation are very outdated and obsolete. Secondly, there is no uniformity amongst the state as far as wildlife crime investigation procedure is concerned. And lastly is the major challenge of specimen identification. For example, today if I illegally smuggle some exotic bird from Malaysia and then bring it here, then for the enforcement agency it becomes very difficult to identify whether it is the same individual bird which has been smuggled from Malaysia. And it is rather in this context of specimen identification that this DNA analysis will be very useful. Now, DNA forensics, especially DNA fingerprinting, is used as a tool for criminal investigation as it focuses on establishing blood relationships, identifying criminals, etc. by matching their DNA sample. But the use of DNA forensics in wildlife is rather a little different. DNA forensics in wildlife crimes will be focused basically on establishing the identity of the species, which will better help in specimen identification like we had discussed. Further, the researchers feel that a molecular level based DNA will improve their investigation process and therefore will significantly help in solving wildlife crimes. This news article has also cited an example where pangolin scales were seized from Siliguri, and when the DNA analysis of these scales were carried out, it was revealed that these pangolin scales were from the Chinese pangolin, whose habitat is restricted only to 5 states in the northeast India. So thus you can see, with the help of DNA analysis, the authorities were able to trace the source of origin, thus making the investigation way easier. Further, the Zoological Survey of India says that it will use the DNA analysis not only for investigation but to also create a reference database where it will assign seizures to the source of origin and better identifying the species. In addition, this database will further help them to further understand the poaching and hunting patterns. Lastly, the Zoological Survey says that it is creating a standard operating procedure in wildlife crime investigation which will help to bring uniformity amongst the states. So with this, let's move on to our next news. The next topic of our discussion appears as two news items in the newspaper. One is an editorial on page number 8 and second is a news item given on page number 13. Both of these are in the context of the banning of unregulated deposit schemes ordinance of 2019. From a syllabus perspective, it will become a part of both polity and economy. So the background of the news is that after the recommendations of the Standing Committee on Finance, the Union Cabinet had given its approval to make some official amendments to the Banning of Unregulated Deposit Schemes Bill of 2018. So in the recently conducted budget session, the Lok Sabha passed this Deposit Schemes Bill of 2018. However, this bill could not get the approval of Rajya Sabha. Hence, in order to get this into force, the government decided to enforce this legislation via an ordinance promulgated by the President of India in accordance with the power given to him under Article 123 Clause 1 of the Indian Constitution. So therefore, it is in this background that the President of India has promulgated the Banning of Unregulated Deposit Schemes Ordinance of 2019 to clamp down on unregulated deposit scheme like the Ponzi's and fake deposit scheme. Before we discuss the provisions of this bill, the main highlight is that it has helped in the creation of a central repository of all deposit schemes and that it is also offering compensation to the victims who have been scammed through these unregulated deposit schemes. Let us look at some of the important features of this Unregulated Deposit Schemes Ordinance of 2019. Now, as discussed earlier, the main aim or the objective of this ordinance was to provide for a comprehensive mechanism in order to ban the unregulated deposit schemes which are currently operational in our country and which is continuously duping lakhs of innocent people. So firstly, this ordinance bans all the deposit takers from promoting, operating, issuing advertisements or even accepting deposits in any unregulated deposit scheme. Further, this ordinance has created 3 different types of offences. The first, of course, is running of any unregulated deposit scheme. Second is doing a fraudulent default in a regulated deposit scheme. And third is wrongful inducement in relation to an unregulated deposit scheme. So firstly, this ordinance has put a ban on any unregulated deposit scheme from promoting or putting any advertisement or even accepting any kind of deposits. In addition to banning the running of unregulated deposit scheme, this ordinance says that even in the regulated deposit scheme, if there is any fraudulent or willful default, then also that would be an offence. And thirdly, under this ordinance, no person can wrongfully induce or solicit a person to invest or deposit in an unregulated deposit scheme. Next, this ordinance has mandated the creation of an online central database, which will be something like a central repository where all information about all deposit schemes which are currently operational in the country will be collected and kept. So therefore, it will make it easier for the central government to regulate the activities and prevent fraud from happening. Next, it is not just for the deposit scheme operators that this ordinance has created some duty, but this ordinance has also made it incumbent upon the newspaper also to verify before they place an advertisement regarding these deposit scheme in their newspaper. Next, as far as grievance redressal mechanism under this ordinance is concerned, this ordinance provides for the designation of a competent authority by the state government whose mandate is to ensure that repayment of such illegal deposits in the event of default is being made to the people, and to ensure that this competent authority has been vested with the powers of a civil court. Next, this competent authority also has the power to refer this matter to the Central Bureau of Investigation. This competent authority can also file an application for the attachment of property and subsequent realization of assets for the repayment to the depositors before the designated court. Under this ordinance, the High Court of a state will notify one or two courts as the designated court to entertain matters related under this ordinance. Further, if any person is aggrieved by the order of a designated court, he has the right to file an appeal to the respective or the appropriate High Court. Next, this ordinance has provided for severe punishment and heavy pecuniary fines with an intention that they will act as a deterrence in case of unregulated deposit scheme. What is unique is that this ordinance has separate penalties for those three different kinds of crimes. That is, separate penalties for those who solicit deposits for an unregulated scheme, those who accept such deposits, and even those who fraudulently default on repaying the depositors. Lastly, in the editorial which has been provided on page number 8, the author has highlighted certain issues and given certain recommendations with related to this ordinance. Firstly, the author says that the legislatures can make the bureaucrats accountable and responsible to ensure that this ordinance is implemented at the ground. Next, the author says that the government should follow the proper process of due diligence so that there can be a clear demarcation between the regulated deposit scheme and the illegal deposit scheme. And lastly, the author issues a caution and says that there should be some kind of checks and balances so that the people in power do not misuse these new rules to de-recognize even the genuine deposit scheme which offer various financial services in the unorganized sector. Now this next news appears on page number 8 and is in relation to the Financial Actions Task Force to keep Pakistan in its grey list. Now the topic of Financial Action Task Force and the issue of Pakistan in its grey list has been covered comprehensively in the DNS dated 23rd February 2019. So to know more details about the same topic, you can refer to this DNS. With this, let's move on to our practice question. Based on our discussion, here is the first set of prelim practice question. Please pause the video and we'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The first question is with respect to high spectral imaging. The first statement, it combines the technology of digital imaging and spectroscopy. This is correct. Second, it collects information only in the infrared wavelength. This is incorrect. It collects information across all the wavelengths in the electromagnetic wavelength. So the right answer becomes A, 1 only. Question number 2 is with respect to wildlife crimes. The first statement, 2 major wildlife crimes include hunting and poaching and illegal trade. This is correct. Second, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime recognizes wildlife crime as a transnational organized crime. This is also right. Hence, the right answer is C, both 1 and 2. Here is your next set of prelims practice question. Please pause the video and we'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. Question number 3 is with respect to the Right to Information Act. The first statement, electronic voting machine is an information under the RTI. This is correct. Second, commercial confidence, trade secrets and intellectual property right of a third party is an exception under the RTI. This is also correct. Hence, the right answer is C, both 1 and 2. Question number 4 is with respect to banning of unregulated deposit scheme ordinance 2019. The first statement, it creates a central repository of all deposit scheme. This is correct. Second, it provides for compensation to victims. This is also right. Third, it provides for attachment of property and subsequent realization of assets for repayment to depositors. This is also right. Hence, the right answer is D, 1, 2 and 3 only. With this, we come to an end to today's discussion. Let's move to the question for the day.